Buckle up, Buttercup, because the Linux Foundation has published their 2024 annual report, and you know that the Lunduke Journal is all over that, like white on rice, baby. As soon as it came out, I grabbed that PDF and started combing through every single word, and it's a weird one. It did not disappoint. Past years of the Linux Foundation's annual reports have had some really sketchy numbers and just some strange focuses. It's been bizarre. It's been politically charged. It's been strange. This year might be, in my opinion, the weirdest, and I'll show you why. Here's the short version of all this. Massive growth in terms of revenue, right? So they are now almost at $300 million of revenue annually for the Linux Foundation. However, spending on the Linux kernel continues to drop and is down to historically low numbers. It just keeps getting lower. And in an absolutely dramatic about face, an almost complete 180, the Linux Foundation hasn't mentioned a single one of their politically charged topics this year. Diversity, equity, inclusion, climate change. Last year's annual report was filled with those things, top to bottom. This year, it's not there at all. It's crazy. It's a huge change for the organization. But let's start with the numbers, because the revenue change at the Linux Foundation is noteworthy. So as of the end of this year, 2024, the Linux Foundation is closing in on $1/3 of $1 billion in annual revenue. $1/3 of $1 billion for a nonprofit, for a foundation. Wink, wink. $1/3 of $1 billion. Crazy. And while the Linux Foundation may technically be a nonprofit, I'm gonna go ahead and say this. Those numbers would make many for-profit companies blush. This is huge growth. If you want to go ahead and grab the charts and click on all the links to all of the sources that I provide in this, I'll put the link to the article, which is free for everyone to read wherever you're getting this show, the podcast, the video, wherever you may get it. So you can go check it all out if you can't see the charts right now. Now, where does the bulk of that revenue come from? Well, corporate membership, right? That provides the majority, over 1/3 of all of the income for the Linux Foundation, to the tune of roughly $125 million per year. Now, how that works is that the highest paying corporate members, right? Meta, Microsoft, Oracle, Samsung, Red Hat, Huawei, and the like. Here's a whole bunch of logos for them. They get a seat on the Linux Foundation board of directors, right? They get a say over what the Linux Foundation does. And the fascinating thing here is, and I've covered this in the past, again, there's the link if you want to listen to me talk about this topic. The Linux Foundation's board of directors is made up almost entirely of representatives of companies who pay them a lot of money. Over 70% of those companies are repeat GPL violators. To me, that's funny. To me, it's funny that the Linux Foundation is primarily governed by a pay-for-play system of GPL violators. That's just funny to me. That's worth noting. Here's a nice little pie chart of GPL violators, 70.6%, to non-GPL violators, 29.4%. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about the spending on Linux, because honestly, I feel like that's the headline. That's the big headline here. One of the peculiar facts about the Linux Foundation is how surprisingly little of their income they actually spend on Linux. You know, the thing that they're named after, the thing that they were created to do. And perhaps even more peculiar still is the fact that the percentage of their revenue spent on Linux appears to decrease every year. Year on year, it gets a little bit lower. In fact, in 2021, so 3 years ago, the Linux Foundation spent roughly 3.4% of their revenue on their namesake project, on Linux. That was already low. That was already low enough that it was startling, and you had to make fun of it, because how could that possibly be? But as of this year, 2024, that number appears to be down to 2.3%. 2.3%. I've got a chart here which shows it going down every year. The total percentage of their revenue that gets spent on Linux goes down every single year. And in fact, this most recent year is the biggest drop yet. Last year it went down to 2 point something percent, 2.89, 2.9%, something like that. Now it's down to 2.3%, and it keeps going down. And now many of you out there are going to be like, well, Lunduke, their total revenue went up. So maybe they're spending more on Linux. It's just that their revenue went up, so the percentage went down. Lunduke, you're being dishonest. Well, here's the kicker. This isn't simply a matter of overall percentages going down. This is also a matter of the Linux kernel spending going down year on year in terms of actual US dollars, right? In terms of raw pre-inflation dollars. So the spending on the Linux kernel in 2023 accounted for roughly 7.8 million. In this year, 2024, it's down to 6.7 million. It dropped over $1 million. That bar chart got a whole heck of a lot shorter in this last year. So it's not only dropping in terms of percentage, it's dropping in terms of actual dollars. At a time when the Linux Foundation is making close to $1/3 billion. Wild. So I also want to point this out. This is just a fun fact. The amount that the Linux Foundation earmarks for corporate operations of the Linux Foundation, so corporate operations expenses, right, is roughly 3 times what is actually spent on the Linux kernel. They spent about 6 million and change on the Linux kernel. I believe it's 18 million something and change, I believe, for corporate operations. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And as time goes on and spending numbers become finalized, we are gaining an increasingly clear picture of the spending priorities of the Linux Foundation. Now let's move away from numbers for a moment, because we could spend a million years on the numbers, and they're difficult. They're difficult to look at, and they're kind of annoying. But there were some other really bizarre things in this report. So in the previous annual report, the 2023 version, diversity, equity, and inclusion were a critical component. Now, I'm not bringing this up in order to make some political point, but I would like to point out the radical change in messaging priorities of the Linux Foundation. So in 2023, in that report, diversity was mentioned 34 times. Inclusion was mentioned 17 times. And there was the general DEI related topic, diversity, equity, inclusion, including LGBTQ related issues. Those were a critical component throughout the entire report. It was page after page after page of DEI. It had whole sections on DEI. And even when it was in sections that had nothing to do with diversity or inclusion or whatnot, it still was mostly about diversity, equity, and inclusion. They managed to shoehorn the topic into everything. It was clearly an absolutely critical cornerstone of everything the Linux Foundation did in 2023. It was critical for them. This year, in the 2024 report, the words diversity, equity, or inclusion are never used. You cannot find those words in the report at all. Not one time. There's no instance of the word equity in the entire 2024 report. Again, diversity was in there 34 times last year. Now it's in there 0. To be fair, though, to be absolutely fair, this sort of topic did come up one time in the report, once, just barely. On the second to last page, in a footnote, you find the following statement, and I'm going to read it to you verbatim because it's the only time this whole topic is even touched on. Quote, 75% of travel funding went to diverse community members, end quote. That sentence right there is the sum total of discussion around diversity in this report. That is a massive change. That is almost infinitely less discussion around DEI and woke political stuff compared to a year ago. It's a massive change. In fact, the LGBT acronym is also never used in the most recent 2024 report. This is another significant change from the previous years that had that acronym in there plenty of times, right? Now, this appears to mark a dramatic shift away from DEI for the Linux Foundation, at least in terms of messaging, right? Now, how this exactly applies to internal policies or funding, it doesn't say. But in terms of messaging, they clearly want to downplay anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's another weird change. In the 2024 Linux Foundation annual report, it also contains absolutely no reference to climate change. Now, many of you are saying, wait a minute, why on earth would the Linux Foundation be even talking about climate change? Well, here's the thing. Last year, the 2023 report, it was filled to the brim with climate change. 37 distinct references and over 10 pages focused on climate change. In fact, you could make a really good argument that last year's annual report from the Linux Foundation was more about climate change than Linux. It was very much about climate change and social justice and DEI politics. That's what last year's report was all about. Now, that focus appears to no longer be a priority for the Linux Foundation. It doesn't even mention climate change. It doesn't mention the Linux Foundation energy projects or the green projects. It doesn't touch on those. It just doesn't, those don't exist apparently, at least in terms of their messaging. At least in terms of what they want to be talking to you and me and other corporate members about. That part is completely gone. That's fascinating, right? So now, if they're not talking about DEI, and they're not talking about climate change, what on earth are the Linux, and they're not really talking about Linux either, what on earth are they talking about? Well, here's a really interesting thing. One of the most prominent new topics in this year's report was the right to fork. And this is a topic that has not come up at all in previous annual reports. They stayed clear of that topic almost entirely, of forking. But the right to fork is mentioned repeatedly, over and over and over again, because many of the new little mini sub-foundations within the Linux Foundation are forked projects, are projects where Linux Foundation corporate members did not like the way a company or organization was governing a particular open source project. So they did a hard fork of that project. They did this many times. And they talk about it in the annual report, and they are proud of forking it. And so they focused on the right to fork over and over again. I'm just going to read this little snippet from the annual report on the right to fork. Quote, "The right to fork open source code is at the very core of open source licensing. All open source licenses grant the right to fork their code, that is to start a new development effort using an existing code as its base. Thus, code forking represents the single greatest tool available for guaranteeing sustainability in open source software. In addition to bolstering program sustainability, code forking directly affects the governance of open source initiatives. Forking, and even the mere possibility of forking code, affects the governance and sustainability of open source initiatives on 3 distinct levels: software, community, and ecosystem." End quote. Now, I agree with that. Forking of software is a core part of open source. That's, if you can't fork, you don't really have open source, right? Now, this is particularly interesting, though, given the stated intention for Russia to hard fork Linux over the recent ban of Russian programmers being official kernel maintainers. Many of you will have remembered this story from just some weeks back. Specific sanctions have come into play in the United States, signed by President Biden, that make it illegal for entities in the United States to have programming contributors from Russia or Russian citizens as programmers. So what has happened is the Linux kernel project has removed a large collection of Russian programmers from the maintainers file, basically saying that they are no longer maintainers of their portion of the Linux kernel. In many cases, that they've maintained certain driver stacks and pieces of functionality for years and years and years. So that's a significant thing that is afoot. We haven't seen the new Russian-specific fork of the Linux kernel happen yet. But the Russian Minister of Digital Development, I can't remember his specific name, but he has stated that they intend to hard fork Linux. So it's interesting that that is coming down the pipe at the same time as the Linux Foundation is declaring the right to fork as being such a critical and important thing. Now, the Linux Foundation doesn't mention Russia or the Russian programmers or the possibility of a Russian fork. But those are all hanging over their heads, I'm sure, as they write this. I'd like to state a few other oddities because there's a lot of weird things in this report. And here's a few of them that just jumped out at me. The first, neither the executive director, Jim Zemlin, nor the board chairperson of the board of directors of the Linux Foundation, neither of them, in their several pages long opening messages at the very beginning of this annual report, neither of them mentions the Linux kernel. nor do they mention desktop Linux or server Linux or mobile Linux. None of it, right? The closest they got to it is there's one passing mention to automotive grade Linux, and then it moves right along. That's the only time Linux is even touched on. It seems strange, right? No desktop, no servers, no mobile, no kernel, no nothing. It just bypasses all of them entirely. Bizarre. It's a little bizarre. Also, the 2024 annual report is only 45 pages long. A significant part of it is taken up with those opening statements, which don't really say much of anything. Compare that to the last year's report, the 2023 report, which clocks in at a whopping 160 pages. If you could fit like 4 of the 2024 reports inside the 2023 reports. It's so much smaller and contains so much less detail. In fact, you get into the last page. It's like the second to last page is where it finally gets into the financials, and it has this big bold display of financial transparency. And there's almost no information there. Like, we get some details, but far less than years past. It's incredibly non-transparent. It arguably does not provide enough information for a nonprofit's annual report. It really doesn't provide a lot of information, provides very little breakdown, especially when you consider the fact that we do not have public access to the IRS Form 990s for the Linux Foundation for the last 2 years. Right? It's 2 years of tax returns we don't have from the Linux Foundation. So all of the numbers that we're getting here are just simply us taking them at their word from their annual report, which has astoundingly little in terms of hard data and graphs and expenditure reports and the like. Now, you may be asking yourself, if they're only spending 2.3% of their revenue on Linux, and we know they're spending a little bit more than that on their corporate overhead, what are they spending their money on? And the reality is we really don't know. We know how many sub-foundations they have and how many are in each organizational group, like what percentage of them are related to AI or blockchains or things like that. But we don't really know how that funding is broken up. That is a complete black box. It is completely unknown to us. And I don't know that we're going to get that information because we haven't in the past. I also want to mention that there was absolutely no mention of the mass banning of Russian developers this year. I thought that was not surprising, but noteworthy. It was one of the most significant events for the Linux kernel and the Linux Foundation to occur in 2024, where the Linux Foundation realistically was forced to adhere to a specific executive order from the President of the United States, from President Biden. And it has direct and fairly extreme ramifications on who is allowed to be involved in programming and developing and working with the Linux kernel, which could result in hard forks in other countries and all sorts of things. And the fact that it was never really mentioned or alluded to throughout this particular annual report, it feels like a glaring absence of information, because it's obviously a critical one. I would have liked to have seen the executive director address this particular issue, but I feel like he really didn't, outside of talking about the right to fork. And the right to fork, though, was all couched in the context of the projects that the Linux Foundation has forked from other people to make their own versions, right? Not forking Linux by Russians. So I would have liked to have seen that addressed. It also didn't address the various other developers banned from the Linux kernel this year for a variety of reasons. And again, I link to all of those in the article. That leaves a lot of questions, a whole lot of questions. What does all of this mean, right? Will the decreasing spending on Linux continue into 2025? It seems like it, right? It's a pretty clear track record. Last 4 years, down every year a little bit more, a little bit fewer dollars, a little bit lower percentage in spending every single year. Will that continue into next year? How low can it realistically go? I think that's worth asking and worth wondering about what that really means for Linux. Will that decreased emphasis on messaging around DEI issues translate into actual real-world changes? And what I mean by that is, the Linux Foundation has had a wide variety of policies that were very DEI policies, right? Like they banned certain people from attending Linux Foundation events because it became known that they voted for Trump. This happened some years back. They provide funding for people to attend their events, which they hold hundreds of every year. Seriously, the Linux Foundation holds events like every couple days. It's sometimes every other day. It's so many events. And they provide funding for people who meet certain criteria, like they have to have the right skin color or they have to have the right gender identity in order to be funded to go to a Linux Foundation event, right? So they've got a variety of very DEI focused policies that they've had in years past. But this is the first time where the Linux Foundation has, it looks like, seemed to try to distance itself from these political topics entirely. There's really no discussion around this in this annual report. And while that wouldn't be noteworthy by itself, the fact that it's such a dramatic change from the previous years. I mean, the last year, it was just page after page after page of DEI topics. This year, it's zero. Don't even mention it. Don't talk about it, right? What does that mean? What does that mean going forward? It's worth watching. It's worth watching. I don't 100% know. Will the right to fork emphasis continue if Russia follows through with their proposed Linux fork, right? So the Linux Foundation is talking about their right to fork a lot. They made that the center point of this annual report, is how great it is that the Linux Foundation picked a few projects out there, maintenance projects and things like that, and forked them and made little sub-foundations around their fork. And they talked about how great it is that they did that, because forking is the most important thing in open source. Well, now, if in the weeks and months ahead, Russia does a hard fork of the Linux kernel, and multiple of the companies which currently are major contributors to the Linux Foundation, like Huawei out of China, start working more heavily with that forked version, right? We could essentially end up seeing a BRICS version of the Linux kernel. If that happens, will the Linux Foundation continue to have their yay for forking attitude? Or will they be upset because that could have a very dramatic hit to their financial bottom line? I don't know. It's a lot of questions. It's a whole lot of questions. I have a ton of them. And realistically, I don't think we're going to get answers for a little while. I am going to reach out to, I have not yet, I've just finished analyzing this this annual report and putting this up there, but I'm going to reach out to the Linux Foundation, Jim Zemlin and the like, as well as a number of the board members for comment on some of these things, because this annual report represents such a dramatic shift for the Linux Foundation in potentially good and potentially very bad ways. And it just opens up a great deal of questions. The fact that the Linux Foundation now has historically low amounts of spending towards Linux at a time when they are banning huge numbers of Linux programmers, Linux kernel developers, long-time ones, file system developers and driver developers and whatnot, for a variety of reasons. And at the same time as they're dropping some of their long-term support releases of the kernel, not all, but some, it's raising questions, lots and lots of questions. And it would be nice to get some answers. I just would like to put this out there because I know that Linux Foundation individuals will be listening to this report. Jim Zemlin or anyone else from the Linux Foundation, I would love for you to come on this show and give us your point of view on these things, because in the absence of official statements from the Linux Foundation, speculation runs wild, right? We had so many issues where people were banned from Linux kernel development, and now we've had dramatic changes in the approach to DEI and climate change and other political topics. What exactly is happening? If anything, is this a change in messaging? Is it just what's happened we happen to be talking about today? Is it a dramatic change in potential policy going forward? In the absence of actual statements and an actual conversation with the Linux Foundation, we're left to assume. Right? And you know what happens when you assume, don't you? So let's get you guys on the show. Let's get you guys publishing some written statements to these, however you want to do it. But this show is open to you. Jim Zemlin, Executive Director of the Linux Foundation, come on, chat with me. You know I don't bite. Thank you to the Lunduke Journal subscribers for making all this possible. Go to lunduke.com. All sorts of links. Click on all of them. Audio podcast feeds. That's where most of you get the show. I know you love it. You can't help it. The sound of my voice is like sweet, sweet gravy. That sounded weird, but I'm going with it. So click on all the links. Thank you to all the subscribers who make this possible. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.